Hey,
Good to see you.
I know I haven't seen you for so long.
How long has it been, do you think?
I don't know. Well, I feel like I've heard about things that you're doing, so I feel
Hmm.
like I've I've kind of seen you more recently than probably we have. I can't remember.
I can't remember either, but it's been a while, but you look the same, so it's very reassuring.
You too.
So let me give a quick bio for those of you who are watching. Jenny is a prize-winning violinist. You're known for championing a broad and eclectic repertoire with a focus on the 20th and 21st century and living composers. You've recorded 13 albums, chamber and solo and concertos, everything from the established repertoire to 20th century repertoire to new commissions. You are a creative juggernaut who has conceived and created a lot of series, including Limitless, the New American Concerto, and Shared Madness. You are a collaborator with dozens of today's most celebrated composers. You are a teacher and lecturer. There you are, Jenny Koh.
Oh my goodness. I feel like I should just leave now.
No, no, no. So let me hear your origin story, because it's kind of famous that you did not choose the violin originally to start playing. So what's the story with how you started music?
Well, my parents are refugees, right?
Mm,
And my mom was a refugee. They're both originally from Korea,
mm,
and they grew up during the war. And so I think they wanted to give me everything that they didn't have,
mm,
which included a consistent education,
mm.
and also music, also ice skating. I mean, there were like a million things.
Right.
I think there was ballet, swimming, which I liked.
Hmm.
I hated moving my body around, so I really
Mm.
hated like ballet and gymnastics and stuff.
Right, right. And so so music was part of that sort of broad education they wanted to give you. And then why the violin? How did that happen?
It was just that that was the only opening at the local Suzuki school. So that's how I ended up in the violin. It was totally by chance.
So totally by chance. So what was there a moment? So how old were you when you started playing the violin?
I think I was probably 3, but like on Suzuki, you start with like on a Cracker Jack box with like a hair curler and like a stick. So I don't know if you would call it
That's
starting
a
to play
great
the violin
description.
at 3.
Yeah, yeah. So you were playing some form of stringed instrument at 3.
Yeah.
So at what point did you know that this was something that not only you were doing, but that you wanted to keep doing, or envision that being your future? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I know that there are colleagues that, believe that they would just, be a soloist like
Hmm.
from a young age. But
Right.
I don't think that that was really in the history of my family.
Hmm.
So, and I don't know. I feel like I was really lucky because there were other people that I respected, like my teachers, mentors, that believed in me way before I ever believed in myself.
Hmm.
And just out of respect for them, I kind of continued. So I don't know. I mean, even at Curtis, I didn't really know.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, for those of you who don't know, is an incredibly high level conservatory where Jenny and I met. So even there, where you're amongst the elite violinists of your generation, you weren't sure if you wanted to pursue this. So was there
It
ever
wasn't
a
that I didn't. I wanted to pursue it. I wanted to
Mhm,
have music in my life without
mhm,
question. I just
right?
didn't know if I could do it.
Wow. So you were having doubts even at that point,
Oh, I have doubts all the time,
all the
even now.
time. So how did you overcome that in conservatory, and how do you keep overcoming that now? And has that changed?
I think for me, it's just about always doing the work, right?
Hmm.
And it's ultimately, it's not even the concert or the performance, right? The majority of work is at home and by yourself. And the goal is to try to be a better musician, to try to be a more thoughtful musician. And so, um, yeah, I mean, that's how I suppose it's just dedicating oneself to the process and the work.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
That
then you
makes
kind
sense.
of just ignore the other parts of it. It's like
Yeah.
if you try the most that you can and the hardest you can, then, you'll end up with whatever result you might end
Right.
up with.
But that's really a deep belief in process and not so much on outcome in a way, as if outcome follows process. And as long as you're committed to that, then something good is going to happen.
Yeah.
And a lot of good things have happened. So as a musician, I mean, you've recorded everything from Bach to not Berg. Have you recorded Berg Concerto? No.
No, I've
Okay.
recorded Schoenberg Fantasy. Does that
Yeah.
count?
Well, your established repertoire to, Jennifer Higdon and Anna Klein. So you have a vast sort of span of the repertoire that you're comfortable with. And I'm wondering, do you approach different types or different genres or different styles of music in different ways, or is it under the larger umbrella of music?
I think it's just under the larger umbrella of music. I mean, the truth of the matter, and I'm sure this was true for you as well, right? That when you first start out, you're learning new stuff constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I was like, why would I suddenly stop learning new works, right? And then I also believe in, imagining and then creating the world that I want to live in. So that ultimately results in commissioning a lot of people, because I want to hear the voices and stories and narratives of people that have experiences far different than my own and that haven't been traditionally heard in classical music. So that was a reason that I started my nonprofit, which is really about advocacy and inclusion. So yeah, and that's the way to kind of change the world, at least for me, that I live in.
So I'm going to come back to the nonprofit and advocacy, but I want to backtrack a little bit and sort of talk more specifically about the music. So is there something in particular that drew you to be interested in the more contemporary new repertoire versus, the war horses that everyone plays and loves? Is there something in you that wants to seek something new? Is there a desire to sort of push boundaries? Is that a really conscious decision, or is that a direction that you went into because it sort of became interesting? Does that make sense? Were you driven to do that versus did that present itself to you?
I mean, well, you remember Felix Gallimere at school, right?
Yeah.
So he was a mentor. He brought me to Marlborough. I mean, I came from a non-musical family, right? So I had no idea what the Marlborough Music Festival was. And he was like, you should go to Marlborough. I was like, what is that? But okay. So and I learned so much from him, I think, through example. Like he really gave example of how to approach music, how to think about music. And I kind of witnessed and observed how he kind of existed as a musician. And part of that is the fact that he had worked with composers. He had worked directly with Schoenberg and Berg and Webern, and also had played for Ravel. So in a way, it didn't feel so different or strange. I mean, and the perspective he had, and just having the ability to learn through him what the composers were imagining of their pieces, and being able to have that connection was kind of extraordinary. Even with Jamie Laredo, and thinking about like the lines of tradition, right, and how it transforms within each generation. So I also studied with Jamie Laredo, and he studied with Joseph Gingold, who studied with Eugenie Zai, right? So when I was learning the Zai sonatas with him, he was like, well, actually, Gingold told me that he actually wanted these 8 bars added at the very beginning, and then it never made it into the edition. So it was kind of, it's a great connection to have. So I think it just felt organic. It didn't feel like I was making a statement.
So organically coming from that whole history of composers passing on their knowledge to players and then that passing down to you. So it's sort of a tradition that's been passed down and an approach to music making, and that's really interesting. So a lot of your projects now focus on the collaborative process between performers and composers, and sometimes there's an intersection between those two roles. So can you speak about that a little bit?
Well, I really believe in community, and I think you know, we were kind of talking about process being important.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is community and working with other people, right? Um, and I mean, it's one of the great joys of my life to work with people that I really love and respect. And that process has always been important to me. And so it was just about really, first of all, engaging with tradition, which is our tradition in classical music, is that composers, Beethoven, Mozart, they were all performers as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it was also about engaging with that. And I had been thinking a lot about our histories, kind of this idea of shared history in classical music. And the people who had been written out, I had been reading, there was, I can't remember the title of it now, but it was a book of poetry by Rita Dove. And she talks about George Bridgetower, or there's a part about George Bridgetower, for whom the Kreutzer Sonata by Beethoven was originally written for him, right? And he was of African descent, but he's kind of been written out of history. They, like, supposedly the legend is that they fought over like a woman, and then Beethoven rededicated it to Kreutzer, who never played it or really cared about it, right?
Right.
But there are records that Beethoven was so enthralled with Bridgetower's playing at the premiere. So just having that kind of relationship, I think, with composers and that working relationship, it does come from our kind of classical music history. And so I just wanted to bring it back into light. So there isn't separation.
Right. Which is interesting, because I think a lot of music outsiders are just looking from the outside in. People assume that classical music is sort of this curatorial kind of art where we're always looking to the past, whereas you're saying people have always collaborated, and you're looking towards the future using these relationships from the past and how they can be translated to the 21st century. So if you are when you want to collaborate with someone, what's the first step? I mean, do you seek out composers how do you find a composer you want to work with? I guess.
Well, you know, the project that I made during the pandemic, which was called Alone Together, and it was really in order to bring a source of income and also visibility to a younger generation of composers who had lost opportunities and were really suffering from loss of income. So that was a situation that is unlike what I usually do, where I went to just my colleagues who I knew had salaried positions or funding through foundations and asked them for recommendations. But usually what I do is I do a ton of research. I start online. I think the other thing is that a lot of women and people of color are kind of squeezed out of conservatories, whether they don't feel accepted or whether they're actually fully rejected, if that makes sense,
right.
And fully excluded. And so it's actually harder, where I have to do more work, because there are a lot more people that might be having premieres and more established venues and are recognized pretty early. So I have to do more research, and that's on the internet. And usually it comes from, you know, going on everywhere from SoundCloud to everything else, YouTube. And then a lot of times I actually will cold call the composers. Like I'll just email them, like off of their websites, or I'll reach out to them through like Instagram or whatever. And that's how I do it. And the steps are that I'll listen, then I ask for scores. That's the next step, so I can see how they notate. And then the third thing is I listen to their works live. So I mean, I not in the pandemic, but I usually fly out to see live shows.
Oh, wow.
Like,
okay.
if I have a day off, and I can do that. And then the last thing is meeting them, and to see if, as you know, human beings, if it feels right, if the dynamic feels right. So that's usually how it goes.
That seems to be a many-step process, and something that you really have to commit to in a way to take those steps. I mean, have you ever midway through the process decided that it might not be a good fit, or you wanted to go in a different direction, or would you keep
Oh yeah.
pursuing someone? No, you would. Okay.
There's definitely been times where you just understand that it might not work for
Mm-hmm.
that time or for
Right.
that particular project or something like that. So the process doesn't continue necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Um, so speaking to that, are there collaborations that you've had where you sort of expected you to be taken to one place where it actually turned directions, it became something that you didn't expect? So something that surprised you in a collaboration.
Oh, I love surprises. So I actually always tell composers and just like go all out. Like you
Mm-hmm.
can always imagine big, and
Mm-hmm.
and then if it doesn't work, it's always easy to scale, right? To
Mm-hmm.
scale down. So, and I love, I mean, when people ask me what's your 5-year plan, it's literally I don't want to know what I'm doing in 5 years because I want to be able to get to a place by that time that I can't even imagine where that
Mm-hmm.
will
Mm-hmm.
be now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I love surprises.
So what's the biggest surprise you've encountered then?
What is the biggest surprise?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, because nothing really feels surprising in the end. I remember, like, I mean, there have been really interesting and creative things
Mm-hmm.
that I found really fascinating and wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I commissioned Andrew Norman to write kind of pieces or a work in conversation with Opus 30 of Beethoven, which is
Mm-hmm.
not a 6, 7, and 8. And he actually created work to just connect every single sonata. So
Mm-hmm.
essentially, you could just play all three over and over with all the connective tissue he had written.
Ah.
So that's actually fun. There's absolutely no kind of pause, but it changes one's perspective on the sonatas because the last movements and the first movements are connected, right? So then the meaning of the second movements or of each movement shifts.
Mm-hmm.
And it also, in its own way, it's still steeped in tradition, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's only like the first bridging, they're called bridging 1, 2, and 3. So the first bridging is just the C minor chord, which comes
Mm-hmm.
from like the C minor sonata, right? But he does it in such a way that people seem to kind of jump out of their seats.
Hmm.
Um, so I think it's all about framing and context.
Mm-hmm.
And also I've like learned a lot from composers. So I mean, it's always been more interesting. Like this is not a natural conversation, right? Because you're
Mm-hmm.
asking me questions and I'm
Right,
not
right.
asking you any questions. Um, so it's like an interview situation. But yeah, I mean, I totally know what I think and is going on in my head. So I'm always more interested in what
Mm-hmm.
other people are thinking about.
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
So interesting. So when you conceive these projects like 2x4 or what else have you, there's so many things. Do these things come to you in a flash, or do they develop over a long time? Are they slow burning ideas of which you have many that sort of one comes to the fore, or does one thing come to mind and you have to pursue that? It's sort of a different way of thinking.
I remember like actually quite a lot of people that know me say that like there's no stopping me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I would say that in my experience, almost every single project that I've wanted to do, people have always told me it wouldn't work in the beginning, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so creating the project and imagining it and kind of knowing what creative direction I wanted to go in has always kind of been clear. But
Mm-hmm.
then trying to convince other people that it's a good idea takes a little more time. So, I mean, now it's easier than it was in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still like, when it's new stuff, it's still kind of,
Mm-hmm.
I think it might be maybe unbalancing
Mm. So,
to some people.
so how do you convince those people that this vision is worth pursuing? How do you balance them then if they feel, you know what I mean?
I think at this point, people will kind of go with me based on my track record. But
Mm-hmm.
in the beginning, it's a lot of trying to, Well, I have to say, I, I am very grateful to the people that did give me opportunities and
Mm-hmm.
did give me the space to kind of explore the repertoire, right? So
Mm-hmm.
initially, like my history is that of how I kind of entered into the music world is I mean, I won the Tchaikovsky competition,
Mm-hmm.
and then I got an English major at Oberlin. So actually, a lot of what I kind of had studied in terms of structures and forms of how to think about things, even historically,
Mm-hmm.
of things written in the past, I think in some way that has influenced a lot of what I do now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I totally forgot the question you asked.
That's okay. I love this train of thought. Keep going. I think it was, how do you, if there's naysayers, how do you convince those people that you have a vision worth pursuing, and how do you bring those people on board?
Oh, you just keep doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
eventually, you know, people will ask me, students will ask me, how do you make a, you know, they want to know how to make a Korean music. And I always tell them it's really hard. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not like it will suddenly get easy after you get to a certain point. It's just
Right.
consistently um, hard. And I remember Jamie told me that too. So
He's a wise man.
yeah, and he had a lot of experience. He was like, Jenny, it's always going to be difficult.
I,
um, so yeah, I mean, it's basically, so I tell them, you know, just do the work and eventually someone will recognize you
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and what you're doing.
Right.
And the other thing is be a good colleague,
Mm-hmm.
um, because it's not about you winning a career. It's not
Mm-hmm.
about winner takes all. I was like, it's about expanding the
Mm-hmm.
piece of the pie and bringing everybody that you believe in. Also,
Mm-hmm.
you bring them all with you
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as you might progress through your career, and
Mm-hmm.
that's incredibly, to me, that's incredibly important. Um, and so I've been lucky that a couple people took chances on me.
Mm-hmm.
So I remembered initially people were like, "Oh, you're just a competition winner. You can't play. You're not known for doing new music."
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I I was very lucky that Miller Theater and George Steele
Mm-hmm.
invited me to perform there. I did a Zoran concerto, and then I did a completely solo violin show with like only composers located in New York, and that was right
Hmm.
after 9/11, right?
Oh,
So it
okay.
was kind
Right.
of a celebration of New York City and who lived here, and so, and then I became like, I guess, the new music person, and then I
Right.
wanted to do Bach and Beyond, and everybody was like, "You're not known as a Bach player, you're a new music person." So that's kind of been every single step, and you know, with Beethoven, you're not a Beethoven player, you're known as a Bach player. You know, so it's like literally every single step of the way. It's like, but you're not that. But it's kind of fun to challenge those expectations
Mm-hmm.
and you know, again, to not sit still and just only to stop doing the work isn't
Mm-hmm.
interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, since you became the new music person, so there seem to be a lot of barriers from a listener standpoint to accepting new music. You know, a lot of people can't conceive of music before like 1950, or I mean even 1915, right? So how do we as musicians help to put down those barriers to invite listeners into a musical language that might not be familiar, or forms that might be unfamiliar? What is the performer's responsibility?
Well, I will communicate that, um, you know, saying that just making a generalized statement, I don't like anything written after 1950 is like saying I don't like any novels or literature or newspaper articles that have been written after 1950. So it just, or like you don't like one new movie that's come out. So therefore you don't like any
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
movies that have ever been made in that particular year.
Right.
So I think part of it is communicating that music and any art form is of our time.
Mm-hmm,
And, you know, a lot of the projects like Shared Madness, even Alone Together, Bridge to Beethoven, they're multiple. kind of chapters, multiple programs,
Mm-hmm.
and quite a few composers are involved. And so I want to show, and I personally like the kind of multiplicity of voices. So
Mm-hmm.
you show that new music isn't just one thing.
Right.
It's many things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's part of how I program, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's helpful.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about the New American Concerto, which is that still an ongoing project that you're pursuing?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Will it ever end?
Um, will it ever end? I don't know.
I
It's
mean,
like the
I hope
5-year
it
plan.
doesn't,
I have no idea.
right? I hope it doesn't because you can keep commissioning all these great works. So, reading this, it's a commissioning project that explores the form of the violin concerto and its potential for artistic engagement with contemporary societal concerns and issues through commissions from a diverse collective of composers. So, I mean, there's this focus on societal issues and these concerns. And was this always a social issues? Were these a focus of your life? Did you come to them? Have they been sort of integrated into your musical experience and also what you want to produce, or how did these two things come together essentially?
I mean, it's integrated in me as a human being. It's
Mm-hmm.
integrated in all of us. What's happening right now, what we observe, what we witness, the action or inaction of people, leaders, um, that's affecting all of us,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, therefore, it of course affects the art form, right?
Mm-hmm.
And um, I believe in the ability for music to bring people together,
Mm-hmm.
and to be able to come to a place of understanding. The whole point of music is that you listen because you want to go to a place that's outside of your normal everyday emotional life, even.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I believe in the power of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I believe that if these particular musical works were to engage consciously with
Mm-hmm.
what was happening, again, there would be more connective tissue to the
Mm-hmm.
present and to issues that people cared about and care
Mm-hmm.
about. So the first concerto in the series was by Vijay Iyer,
Mm-hmm.
and it's actually fitting for right now. It's called Trouble, which comes from John Lewis's civil rights activist and representative in Congress, in his phrase "good trouble," that there's time to make good trouble, to make societal change, which is vital and important. Um, and there's a movement that's dedicated to Vincent Chin, who was Chinese American and beaten to death in the 80s by auto factory workers who believed he was Japanese and stealing their jobs. And this was before hate crimes legislation. So they paid, I think, a small fine, and that was it. So it was about also engaging with Asian American history, my own history, because I remembered that was very traumatic to our family. Because,
Right.
of course, my parents came from Korea, which means that they were the majority in Korea. And in Korea, it was very clear that other East Asians are different, and that each country had its own individual history and culture. And they were like, but when it comes to race, I think especially in America, it doesn't matter. It's just the appearance and the skin color. So I think they were really traumatized by that. And it was an important moment, I think, for Asian Americans, because it was the impetus for political engagement. Because there was a change of immigration policy in 1965, which essentially allowed, it had been racist policy before, where they had put quotas on anybody that was not of Western European blood. And in 1965, they stopped that quota system. So that's when you see this influx of people from Asia, South Asia, from Africa, entering the United States, and it kind of changed the landscape. But in the 80s, so you have this huge kind of cultural shift. But in the 80s, it, 20 years, around 20 years after my parents had gotten here, that, I think the shock for them that people just hated us because of our skin color was really disturbing to them. And also that they wouldn't have seen the difference between different cultures. They were like, but Italians aren't the same as French. I mean, why would people all think like that every single Asian person is the same? It's like saying every single European person, white person is exactly the same.
So speaking to that, I mean, right now we're experiencing these incredible societal upheavals and, a re-acknowledgement of these systemic, inequalities and prejudices. And how can artists react? And you sort of already spoken to this, but to this particular moment in our history, what do artists do?
I mean, I don't know if it's because of my history of who I work with and who I advocate for. But for example, for Alone Together, it was 20 commissions, 40 premieres, and I think every person that was commissioned was either a person of color, woman, or non-binary. And I think we had there was one white man in there, but just by chance. I mean, these weren't even people that I had directly chosen. And so I think it's just about showing that we want to listen and that we want to see and hear the stories and histories of people that don't look like us, that were raised in different ways in different places from us. And in the end, I really think it's our loss to not hear their stories. It's really, we are being deprived if we are not inclusive. And I think I'm also really dedicated to equity, because I do believe that in a kind of classical music setting, I believe a lot of people have been excluded from the conservatory setting. And it's, so in terms of equity, like, for example, in that last project in Alone Together, I was working with a lot of people who came from different musical traditions, right? And I don't really think about genre. I just think that there are great musicians and really terrible musicians, right? and there's mediocre musicians in there too.
The whole spectrum.
But it's not like this person is like whatever, only a sound artist, and then that person is in jazz, and that person's world music, and that person's classical. So I don't really see that. But in terms of equity, for some of these works that were like 1 to 3 minutes long, I would spend like 8 hours with those composers, right? In terms of being able to kind of communicate their creativity in a classical music notation and tradition. And sometimes it was even as simple as I would ask them to sing what they were looking for, and then I would notate what they were saying. And for some reason, I guess it's because I'm pretty, I think a lot about orchestration and the history of classical music and notation, and also work with a lot of composers about how to bring their voices into classical music. So I've been brought in for a lot of master classes for composers and for composition seminars and for composition classes. And there it's really also about bringing in musical tradition, right? So sometimes I'll just have them look at the notation of something older, like a piece by Brahms, and ask them, okay, when you just see this page, what do you think is the most important line? What is the primary line? What is the secondary line? What is the counterpoint? And once I think that language is understood, then like notation is understood. It's a kind of mutual respect, I think, because as an instrumentalist, it takes decades to just even sound decent. Like the learning curve on violin is like, I'm like grateful to my parents, like that I didn't like drive them insane with my like scratching and squeaking in the beginning. So there's a steep learning curve. So it takes a long time, and it takes a long time, as I'm sure you know, to parse through scores and to come with your own personal understanding of the work. And that comes through looking at things like articulation and dynamic markings, right? And so that's something that I try to communicate to them. And I think it helps them then, you know, when they write pieces like orchestral pieces, it kind of clarifies what they want to somebody that has come through this musical tradition.
So you spoke briefly about your work as a teacher, and could you sort of expand on that? And I particularly am interested in when you have to explain something to somebody else in a simple way, you need to find a clear way of externalizing an internal idea. So for me, when I teach, I almost always come out of the experience knowing more than when I went in, because I've been taught in a way. So how do you experience teaching and lecturing, and how does it inform you as a musician?
It's actually interesting because it will remind me of how I think about music, because I have to actually articulate the thought process, which has kind of become automatic in its own way. But one of the things that I always tell my students is don't fall into habits, right? So by actually articulating things, it reinforces the ideas that are important to you. And it's also because I'm so lucky that there were people in my life that advocated for me and who believed in me, because there's no way that I would be here as a musician speaking to you if it had not been for all of these people who kind of guided me down this path. So there's no question that was always going to be something that I wanted to kind of pass on. And it's also that kind of, I'm interested in this kind of passing on of knowledge, and also the evolution of kind of performance practice from generation to generation. And I also, I mean, I know this is super geeky, but I collect, you know, historical recordings because I want to get closer and closer to the composer as well. And also, like, they're just great interpretations, right? So it was interesting to me because Bronislaw, it was like I learned things. It was edifying because Bronislaw Huberman had actually performed the Brahms concerto in front of Brahms.
Oh,
and,
wow.
Was it Brahms? Yeah. And then also there's like the only recording of Joachim, who of course was colleagues with Brahms, is of a movement of Bach. And from his playing, there's like a mythology that romantic music, like Brahms, whatever, Dvorak, Schumann, that the romantic style of playing is to vibrate on every note, right, as a string player, and that really did not exist, and is not true, right? That was the tradition that started with kind of Fritz Kreisler. So it was fascinating. Like Joachim doesn't vibrate very much, and you can tell that the thought process was that vibrato was really just an embellishment. So like one would create an embellished like a cadenza, which is an embellishment of the concerto in itself. That was kind of the function of vibrato. But that also taught me that there could be so much more expressivity through your right hand, through just the bow arm. So, you know, it's just about learning all of these different things. And then through Felix, you know, with Berg and Schoenberg and Webern, those composers could not imagine their music not being played with a great deal of rubato, glissandi, vibrato in the
Mm-hmm.
most, what we now conceive as the romantic way of playing.
Right,
So it's
right.
not clinical at all. Um, and I found the I have a recording of the premiere of the Berg violin concerto.
Really?
Yes. So unfortunately, Berg died before the premiere.
Mm-hmm.
I had this idea to do like all last works of composers of like,
Mm.
there was going to be like the Schumann Fantasy and the Janacek violin concerto and the Berg violin concerto. And I remember the CD person said, that just sounds really depressing. Like
I
all of
was
the
thinking,
composers
what would
like
the
died
album
right
be
after
called, you know?
last words.
Last words, last moments. You're right. It gets a little bit morbid, but it's an
Yeah.
interesting idea to see composers really at, you know, ostensibly their most developed, with their final
Yeah,
voices.
so he died. So the recording is with Louis Krasner playing the violin, and then Anton Webern is the conductor. He
No
stepped in because
kidding.
Berg had died. Yeah.
Wow. Um, I'm looking at the time. I got a few more questions and we need to wrap up, but I'm curious. I mean, you started this together apart. Did I get that? Is it together apart? Alone together. Oh my God. I'll just make up a title. Alone together in really in response to what's happening during this lockdown and pandemic. And, you know, all musicians have been affected. And I wanted you to speak to how it has affected you personally and what you look forward to as the world shifts and opens again, with the understanding that it might not be what we've experienced in the past, or we might never go back to that in a way. So how do you feel now, and how do you want to feel in the future?
Well, of course, when it happened, I remember like all of my work canceling in like on the hour over
Mm-hmm.
like a 2-day period, like
Mm-hmm.
every hour. Okay, this canceled, next hour. Okay, that canceled.
Yeah.
So of course, my first reaction was I was totally freaked out because I was losing all my income and
Mm-hmm.
work, and but then immediately I was like, oh, it's gonna be so much worse for other colleagues, and in
Mm-hmm.
that sense, I'm really lucky. But for me, it's really about always imagining the other side of this pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can, again, it's about creating these imagined worlds that we want to live in. So it's a constant, I constantly try to look at the future and imagine the end of this pandemic on the other side and looking back at this period. And
Mm-hmm.
I question, what kind of person was I in this
Mm-hmm.
period? Was I only scared and terrified? Was I only concerned about myself? Was I a kind person? Did I help other people? Did I do anything constructive? You know, so because it's so hard, it's like every day is kind of mushed together
Mm-hmm.
because of the shelter in place, and it's so unlike the life that I normally or had previously.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned a lot. Like I learned that my entire life was built around traveling. Like I
Mm-hmm.
had a computer that is the lightest weight computer,
Mm-hmm.
but can barely function as a machine. I also rediscovered my relationship with paper and writing on paper, because I only travel with a carry-on, even if it's for like 2 or 3 weeks. So
Right.
like even like half a pound, I will not include it
Mm-hmm.
in my suitcase. So a lot of those things have changed, and I think the good things are that I've really seen incredible acts of generosity and kindness. Of course, there's the other side of the coin
Yes.
also,
Mm-hmm.
where I see things that I wish I had never seen. Um, so, but yeah, I think this is a time period to imagine the world that we want at the end of this pandemic. And this is the time to think about it,
Mm-hmm.
and to think how we can take action.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine, or I believe that that is why people have come out in protests,
Mm-hmm.
and advocating for change,
Mm-hmm.
to stop um, violence and oppression
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
against Black people in America, and to stop and to put a pause on the history of that violence
Mm-hmm.
and oppression and disembodiment. and disenfranchisement of people based on race.
And I love this notion of imagining the world that you want, which opens possibility for change, as you said, rather than stagnating and being sort of very stuck in this moment, which does feel like, as you said, days mush together. So what does that world look like for you?
Well, I mean, I keep saying, so for Alone Together, I mean, I wanted to kind of do things that I would never, you know, have had time for, wasn't, you know, or I used the excuse that I didn't have time for it.
Mm-hmm.
So like for Alone Together, I learned how to use Final Cut Pro, which was exciting, and it totally like made my computer crash because it's a barely functioning machine.
Right.
And the next step is I want to learn Logic, which is a music recording program, if people don't know. And yeah, and I mean, the great thing about teaching also, because I teach at the new school at Manus, is the thing that I love about universities is you have access to all this information, right? So I've been reading a lot of things that I've been meaning to read for a long time, and I mean, I did this in the past, but I gave a keynote speech. I think it was last week. So I've had the opportunity to do even more research than I normally would. So that was really fun.
Yeah.
That was really nice. And I just have more, I have easy access.
Yeah. Yeah.
To those authors and those books and those materials.
That's great. Well, Jenny, thank you so much for joining me and talking about everything that you've been doing. I really, this together, I'm going to get it wrong again. Together Alone.
Alone Together.
I want to call it something else. I've really been enjoying that. And to me has been remarkable watching a fellow artist finding a way to remain creative and to engage their colleagues and to, you know, make a positive impact, because I think that's what we all hope to do. So it's been really inspiring watching what you're doing.
Thank you.
And just, you know, knowing the incredible person you are. So
I feel like the next thing has to be me interviewing you, Sarah. I feel like all I've done is talk about myself.
Right, no, the logical way of things. Maybe one of these days, but yeah, it's good to see you, and thanks so much for joining me, and good luck with everything. And I hope to see you in person at some point, and to work together and do something really interesting. So thanks, Jenny.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks.
Right.
I have no idea how to get off, but
we'll just
I'm
press the end button.
I'm like
Bye.
Here we go. Bye. No.